Hello everyone, our names are Juliana Villamil and María José Gómez, and today we're going to talk about the cultural conflict of indigenous communities in Colombia. First, I'm going to talk about the context. Considering the article Colombia's Indigenous Situation, written by UNHCR, explains that armed conflict in Colombia has hurt indigenous community the most because many have lost their lands and it is important for their cultural practices, and this cause problems because their lands it is a big part of their art. On the other hand, to speak about of the historical background of cultural indigenous conflicts, we can see in the lower part an infographic. The principal numbers are the total of victims, that is 5,011 to the date of 2020, with more than 2,300 murders and 659 for forced disappearances. These data were obtained from the Center of Historical Memory. In the second part of context, I'm going to talk about the key indigenous groups affected considering the data by UNHCR in 2011. Principality stay the Arhuaco community that are residing in the Sierra Nevada of Santa Marta. Their community has been affected by the armed conflict significantly. The principal victims are 12 members were killed, 2 disappeared, and 2 victims of landmine accidents. Next, state Cancuamo community that are neighbors to the Arhuaco. This group have also suffered extremely the consequences for the armed conflict in Colombia, like forces disemployment, violence, facing threats that jeopardize their cultural survival. And finally, state the Agua community, located in the department of Nariño of Putumayo. And this group have been victim of massacres, forced disemployment, and confinement due to ongoing armed conflict in their region. In the final part of context, I'm going to talk about the asymmetries of power and discriminations in this cultural conflict of indigenous communities in Colombia, considering the authors Ovalle Almanza and Vázquez Salazar writing the article in 2022. Well, summarize the article describes how indigenous people have fewer opportunities in terms of political, economical, education, and healthcare, but exists laws like ALO Convention and the UN Declarations of Indigenous Rights that try to help the communities. But the governments often do not give real power to indigenous people to participate in the decisions. Other difficult is the conflict over land and natural resources because the armed conflict and illegal activities create conflicts about the land in the Andean region. In this region, communities of indigenous face violence and disemployment. For example, in 1985, over 80,000 cases were reported in Antioquia, Cauca, and Tolima. Well, and the final difficult is the cultural erosion and threats to identity. Because Colombia has a big diversity and exist 87 indigenous groups and more than 60 languages, but violence, armed conflict, and disemployment threatening their survival. For example, recently in Colombia, 34 indigenous groups face extinction due to the conflict.
The second item in this video is what is a conflict. This conflict is based in 4 different parts. The first is the land and the territories, basically that the question groups use the territories to exploit illicit crops and natural resources. The result of this activity is the violence and destruction of the culture and the system of the indigenous communities. The second is common with the first part. The presence of the armed actors are in like to guerrillas in Colombia and the illegal groups, how are they willing to do anything for their military and the territorial objectives? And the third part is the discrimination and the historical exclusion for the indigenous community. The societies has had a great impact to the discrimination of their land. In this problem affect the culture of these communities and the development of territories in Colombia. The fourth part is the most important part of this conflict, is the forced displacement, because the government is not responsible with the situation. The illegal groups invade the indigenous territory through the violence, silence, and intimidation to innocent people like seniors, children, and the other people that is member that indigenous communities. This problem is a historical conflict in Colombia in places like Cauca, and this community are vulnerable and this violence don't stop. This conflict is a past conflict and actual conflict, and the Colombian people know that is not possible. Don't stop this.
Now I'm going to talk about some solutions to their conflict. For example, first is legal framework and policies. In this item, Constitution in Colombia and the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Communities propose solutions like protection land, better services like provide health care, education, better jobs, stronger laws, indigenous participation in the political decisions, and other cultural preservations. The second solution is the recognition of indigenous territories. The ILO Convention says indigenous peoples have the property and the right to own and protect their lands, and the governments can't use their land without permissions. But in the real life, exists many cases these laws are not well enforced. Well, and the third solution is political representation and advocacy. The same convention also says indigenous people must be included in the decisions that affect them. The government must consult them before making policies or projects that affect their lives, their lands, and their cultures. In addition, the first solution includes the international organisms. For example, the World Food Program helped indigenous communities with solutions like giving food, supporting farming local projects, and working with indigenous leaders for themselves and protect their traditions. Finally, some perspectives for the future and challenge include that the indigenous groups fear to the political participation and the respect for their traditions. To solve this, the same community leadership conservation projects and working with international organisms to project a better future with better laws and stronger government support.
We are talking about the foreign, in this case is the paradigm. We choose the governance paradigm because this paradigm is presented as a new tool that is promised to involve the social actors in addition to governments in decision making, process related to development and the extraction activities. And in this case, it can be to great help in the conflict experience by the indigenous people in Colombia, since they will have a greater chance of they being her own country and their rights will not be violated as has been customary in recent years.
A recent news story that describes the cultural conflict of the indigenous communities in Colombia is the article called Renewable Energy Ambitions in Northern Colombia Collide with Indigenous Worry, published by AP News the last week. This article summarizes how the community of Guayús in La Guajira faces the construction of wind farms on their sacred lands. This idyllic park is called La Guajira Wind Farm Number 1. It started in 2020, but faced strong oppositions, and although it began producing energy in 2022, but now it's not yet connected to the grid. In the other hand, the Colombian government promised to respect indigenous rights, but social tensions have halted 57 planned projects involving international companies. In this way, the news finished with the voices of the Guayú community that demand genuine participation in the decision-making processes in placing respect for their cultures and their values.